Yesterday, NAMIC CEO Chuck Chamness appeared as my guest for a COVID-19 report. We had some technical difficulties during the session, but Chuck was good enough to complete the interview at the end of the broadcast day. Here now is the entire interview, front to back. COVID-19 and its effects are being felt both far and near, internationally and domestically, across our economy and certainly for the insurance industry. Here to provide some insights in the latest developments of COVID-19 is a friend to AAIS, NAMIC CEO Chuck Chamness.
Hey Ed, how are you?
Great.
It's hard to believe it's been about 2 months now. We've been in this that long. I think back to those days in the first half of March where we were looking at our own pandemic policy at NAMIC, and we'd had it since H1N1 and had never really seriously considered it until we started to hit trigger 1, trigger 2. We made it trigger 4, and by mid-March we're working 100% remotely, including our insurance company NAMICO, which of course puts us in the same shoes as all of our member companies, AAIS, and basically the entire economy as things shut down then. For our industry, there were many immediate threats and challenges that we're responsible for handling for our members. We always talk to our staff about our responsibility at NAMIC, and that is, to make sure that we represent our member companies that are heavily regulated. What happens in government matters to them. And so being able to do that, even in the most trying circumstances, which is really what we've been in for the last 2 months, is kind of the big picture about. I think, our members, your members who are watching today know that there have been a variety of specific threats. There was desperation on the part of policymakers in many cases, both at the federal and the state level, looking for some kind of a solution. One of the early focus areas was on business interruption insurance.
Yeah.
Some very clever attorneys and some very famous celebrity chefs were involved in bringing that to the nation's attention, which, by the way, is using just the latest page in the playbook of the trial bar, which is get out in front and carve, create the public opinion that will then make everything easier going forward in your legal cases. It shouldn't work that way, but it might, and that's certainly what they intend. So, Business Interruption Group, a lawyer named John Hodeling, very prominent, drove a lot of media. For us, we've had, I think we've had 8 states, about a dozen retroactive business interruption insurance bills entered, and that includes DC, which was probably the most serious threat that we faced. The federal government in Congress, we've had 2 retro BI bills introduced, one of them bipartisan, slightly bipartisan, but real threats out there. We've had, in the states, besides the retro BI bill, we've had some serious comp challenges, dangerous proposals, possibly catastrophic proposals for, rebuttable presumptions in the comp space for first responders, and also the larger bucket of essential workers. Essential workers is a definition that keeps getting redefined, or at least the threat of redefining essential workers continues. And of course, the challenge with the pandemic is, how do we determine that this was, a disease that was contracted in the workplace rather than somewhere else? So it's quite complicated. Just this morning on my podcast, I had Mike Bork with a member company, Maine Employers Mutual, and he was describing some of the challenges. They're a comp writer in mostly New England and down through the Mid-Atlantic. But I didn't even mention the media outreach, which has been part of this too. And with all of the seeding of stories about how unfair our industry has been to the celebrity chefs, with the help of their trial lawyers and their public relations firms, there's been a ton of media. I think we've had 850 media mentions in the last 6 weeks from all of the biggest sources, plus our industry sources, much of it on business interruption, which is clearly the story they're trying to drive, although a little bit on the comp and also on some of the government responses that we talked about.
Well, Chuck, we've got a number of questions coming in from viewers. I'd like to, there's one here as we're just talking about regulators. A lot of the challenges that insurers face with the requests from regulators, as you noted in your letter this week, are the ability to rapidly provide data on the requested timelines at the level of detail and on data points that they may not collect today. Even if the deadlines are extended, how are the other issues resolved for this crisis and the next?
Well, the questioner is correct. There have been at least a couple of nationwide data calls recommended by the NAIC. Many states have not yet put them in place, but they've been on business preparedness and on business interruption. Then there have been non-COVID data calls like storm-related data calls, federal TRIA data reporting, among others. Actually, Michigan, I think, is moving forward with a new no-fault data call. So the question of data calls is an important one because we know they're very taxing on companies, and they always occur when there is a catastrophe of some kind going on, whether it's weather-related or, in this case, a pandemic. Clearly, I think for Ed to speak a little to how OpenIDL or just blockchain could be used, I know that was one of the early and easy to understand aspects of blockchain, to the extent that this data already exists and the insurer only has to give permission for the regulator to look into, whatever data sets it's most interested in, depending on the case at hand. So Ed, I don't know if you'd like to speak a little to how blockchain can be used to prevent these time-consuming and onerous data calls.
Well, thanks, Chuck. Yeah, you and I have been talking about our blockchain initiative, OpenIDL, since it started a couple years ago, and it was great to connect with you when it was over a month ago, and talk a little bit about what this platform could do in terms of helping the industry, helping carriers through this point. Obviously, it was built for just this type of purpose. We've been working very closely with state regulators and also with the NAIC and our carriers, trying to streamline the regulatory reporting process that's pretty antiquated at this time, and it really shows its cracks at the time of a pandemic. So yeah, when you're talking about data calls, when you're talking about coordinating with the 50 regulators and also with hundreds of carriers during a pandemic, with trying to collect new data, trying to collect it timely, it's a challenge. But that's why we set this up. And also, when you think about you mentioned the coverages that are being impacted, the workers' comp, certainly auto we've heard, but business interruption is a kind of a flashpoint, and it's one of the more complicated coverages to write, and certainly through claims handling. But the beauty of the blockchain network is its ability to not only effectively get additional data in, and data that we may not have collected in the past for this type of coverage, and you need to during a pandemic because those businesses and those carriers are under a lot of stress. So if you want to reach out to state payroll or state tax records or federal tax records and other data sources you may need to actually effectively pay the claims, and also avoid any type of fraud and just errors that could occur. So no, we're continuing to work with regulators, continuing to work with our carriers to hopefully to assist any way we can with whatever solution comes forth. And I know you've been working very much on the federal level with that regard. So yeah, we're standing ready to help when we can. And maybe we should move over to the federal side. On the government side, How do you think our federal government is handling this situation, in your opinion?
Well, it depends. Are you talking about the response to keep small businesses on life support through PPP, or are you talking about some of the more troublesome provisions around retroactive business interruption insurance?
Well, I hope we don't go down that path, but I'd say more feasible solutions that hopefully can solve this issue.
So that would be really the next area that the federal government is looking at, and I think there'll probably be some developments on it yet this week. And it's been kicked around. It's easily named, which is PRIA, Pandemic Risk Insurance Plan or Act, and so that name is obviously handy from TRIA. But we happen to think that the characteristics and the components of TRIA are very ill-suited to this pandemic risk that we're trying to solve for. The federal government is trying to solve for. We have, with our board, worked to establish. In fact, just at a board meeting last Thursday, we did some policy principles around pandemic solutions, and they will guide our advocacy in this area. And they will lead us to a conclusion that, as I said, is much different than the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act program. We have, been working collaboratively, not just with our member companies, but also with others in the industry, to hopefully come together around a kind of unified single plan that I think will look, the federal pandemic loss program is a working title we have for the solution that we've developed. It's not a extremely complex solution. It involves the government. We know in terms of pandemics and the nature of pandemics, the correlation is too high. It's too fast developing. I mean, think about all of us sitting there on New Year's Eve. Basically, none of us had any sense that this year would be as 2020 has turned out to be. And we know that everything has happened not only fast, but has been so comprehensive and correlated that the entire economy was shut down. That's just not an insurable risk. So we know the government has to be there as the backstop. We think the industry can play a role voluntarily through administration, and not just companies, but agents clearly could have a role. But as I said, I think this will be the next debate in Congress. There's already a couple of PRIA-like proposals that are being kicked around, and we hope to turn the debate to something that we think will be more reasonable and more effective, and do that in a unified way, we hope, with the industry, both primary insurers, reinsurers, brokers, agents, all together to support that.
Oh, that's great. We've got another question in that I think goes beyond that. Somebody who's thinking very strategically. I mean, we're trying to find a solution to what's happening right now. But the question is, and as you mentioned, the only backstop there could be is it has to be a federal one. But what position do you think the federal government is going to be in to really provide an answer, given the amount of stress they're seeing in terms of writing larger and larger checks, and as we go further and further into the unknown? I'll see if you can answer that one. I'd love to hear your answer.
Well, I can't say that I'm not troubled by the amount of debt that's been added to future generations in just the past few weeks and months, but I also can't really tell my member of Congress or those that I know and would provide input to of any other way they could have handled this. I mean, the federal government does have broad shoulders and deep pockets, the deepest pockets. And so, I think going forward, and this again gets to a deliberate plan. We know that in this, we can talk all day about Build Strong Coalition and our efforts for more than a decade now to help government plan better for catastrophes, the kind we're used to seeing, like Category 4 hurricanes that strike the Atlantic coast. we know that government assistance is wasteful and not very effective when it's done on the fly through special congressional appropriations. And that's why we've been working through Build Strong to help the federal government plan and pre-fund for disasters, help communities prepare. We think some of those same principles can be at work here, which is that this plan, whatever it is, we think will involve policyholders opting in and in return receiving a certain amount of coverage, again, through a government fund. So it wouldn't entirely fall on the taxpayer to pay, as the most recent $2.5 trillion that have been paid in the last 6 weeks have, but rather to have the businesses cooperatively engaged based on what their needs are. Again, with the government being the ultimate backstop, a line of credit to the Treasury certainly would be necessary. But those are the kind of concepts that are being looked at now, and the Congress is looking at, and we'll be engaged in that discussion to help them come up with the right answer.
Well, we do live, I said, we do live in interesting times, and I guess sometimes you want to be grateful for that. But we've certainly gone through some interesting times in the last few decades with the impact of 9/11 on our industry, storms, the impact of climate change, certainly with the storm seasons around the turn of the century down in Florida and then the Gulf Coast, and more recently up on the Northeast with Sandy. What do you think, when we look back at this, where do you think this pandemic is going to lead the industry? Is it going to have a big impact, or is it going to be hopefully just a bump in the road?
That's a great question. And it's interesting you bring up those reference points. Of course, they're ones that we share and that we've been around this industry for. 9/11 was the event that we thought could never happen here. It only happened in faraway land. The financial crisis in 2008 was the event that seemed like it had been solved for, as if the Great Depression and some of the financial catastrophe was behind us. And now this, you could say, is again a back to the future type, the 1918 pandemic would be a corollary. I think as an industry, though, this one will affect us permanently and, have a sustained impact. I think it'll be an important reference point, and not just for the insurance industry, but I think for all business. When we look at the ability to do remote work, as we are somewhat successfully right now in terms of this interview, I think in terms of the way we view risk, the way we view contracts. I mean, these are all things we've had, and we continue to have some scary times. And that I think a question can be asked that if the security of the insurance contract is destroyed, can insurance itself exist? These are the legal documents that people make plans around, and that both on the insurance company side and on the policyholder side. And it's a very, very dangerous and probably unconstitutional precedent should legislatures decide to retroactively rewrite these contracts. I think for our faith in experts, I'd like to say this as a societal change that I think would have impact on our industry. We find in, say, even a year ago or less on Capitol Hill, people choose their own facts. And I think this is a societal issue as well. They're less reliant on experts, and perhaps one silver lining of this might be greater reliance on experts, that experts really are people that you need to rely on at all times, not just in times of crisis where you're looking for answers desperately when no easy answers are out there. I mentioned remote work, but I think, again, for us at NAMIC, we're finding out we can do jobs, even jobs like lobbyist, advocate, government affairs. There's terms like, wear a lot of shoe leather out on this issue, indicating that you've got to walk through the hallways and have face-to-face meetings. And we bring hundreds of our members every year through Congressional Contact Program to DC to talk with their elected leaders. We fought the most the greatest threat to us on business interruption so far was the District of Columbia's City Council, which operates like a legislature, and they were going to put in place a retroactive business interruption, policy. And we did all of the advocacy basically from a Friday until Tuesday, when the vote was taken, and it was removed from the emergency measure. Rather surprisingly, I would say, but every bit of the advocacy was done through phone calls, emails, outreach, letters from members of Congress. It was a tremendously successful effort. In our team, we were just quite lucky to have an individual on our staff who formerly worked for the district government and the council as a lobbyist for us on the Hill who could be put into effect, a couple other lobbyists, but all of it was done remotely, which I thought was quite a remarkable task.
Yeah, as you were reflecting there, how you were able to deal with the situation of, working remotely under some very serious situation. And I was reflecting how much our industry has adapted. I remember after 9/11, there were a lot of people who were saying, a lot of companies would go away, the industry would never be the same again. And certainly it changed, but it adapted and it responded, and it showed its resiliency. And sometimes it's hard to see that in the eye of the storm, but I really do feel that we're well on our way to do that in the response. And I just want to thank you for your efforts and your leadership at NAMIC, because without those responses, there's a lot of knee-jerk reactions out there that people trying to solve short-term issues, but not looking at the big picture. So, Chuck, I want to thank.
Thanks, Ed.
Yep.
Let me, if I might, I was thinking about again in that kind of big picture wrap up, a positive note. It comes from an unlikely source, but I've been reading these last couple weeks a book by Eric Larson, The Splendid and the Vile. It's basically the story of London during the Blitz, the 56 days the Nazis bombed London, and Churchill's leadership is what it focuses on. But I love the takeaway from that experience that's shown in that book around, how people in these amazingly challenging circumstances came up with, new characteristics, newly discovered human goodness and altruism. There's great little stories of, Churchill visiting the East End and people calling out to him, and he would weep when he saw their conditions and what the bombs had done, and yet they had this great spirit. We're in a cycle of populism that has really created a lot of challenge in our political environment where we work, but in our society. And I wonder if this might generate kind of a new attitude. We're all in this together. Something like I've seen in that book. It may be not a perfect connection, but it is on my mind as I'm reading the book. And by the way, it's a great book. If you're at all interested in Churchill or World War II or that point in history, it's extremely well done, and I'd recommend it.
He's one of my favorite authors, but I don't think I've read that book, which I'm surprised. I thought I'd read all his books, as you mentioned in the intro to that, if that's the upbeat, the Blitz in London. But you're right. From those things comes out some incredible courage, bravery, and as you said, hopefully people coming together to work this out, the problems of the day. And we certainly have ours. It's the health side, the economy side of this, and also the challenges we have on our political sides. So hopefully, the next main event meeting when I'm interviewing you, we'll be down someplace near a sandy beach.
No. We agreed on that at the beginning. The next time I'll interview you at a NAMIC meeting, and we'll learn more about some of the incredible stuff that AAIS is working on. Ed, I do appreciate the time and you're having me on this.
Thank you so much, Chuck. Appreciate it. Stay safe.
You too.